Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Katie Rose Hejtmanek. She's professor in the Department of Anthropology and the Children and Youth Studies program at Brooklyn College, CUNY, and she's co-editor of a book we're going to talk about today, Gender and Power in Strength Sports, Strong as Feminist. So, Katie, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you, Ricardo. I'm very excited to be here.
So tell us first, what is the premise of this book exactly?
So the book is a sort of investigation of strength sports, which is a particular kind of sport based on power and brute force. So strength, the premise of the book is to move weight. And to kind of investigate that from a feminist perspective. A couple of friends and I got together we were all some sort of strength athlete, and we decided we only see a certain kind of people. There's all these interesting things happening in our gyms. And so we decided to see if there was an interest to put something together on the concept of strength sports from an interdisciplinary, but really a kind of pointed feminist perspective.
We're going to get into that interdisciplinary bit about the book in a second, but in what ways would you say, generally speaking, that sports would intersect with politics, since we're going to get also into that and feminism specifically?
Yeah, excellent question. So for me, I'm a cultural anthropologist by training, and my main focus in my strength sports research is CrossFit. And as someone who kind of studies culture and societies, I would say that there's really nothing about sports that isn't political. So you can actually, any question you would say, like, how is that just a political part of the activity, the human activity. But a really general question that, or a general example that can be used to understand that is, we're having the Olympics coming up, the Summer Olympics 2024 in Paris. And that is a geopolitical event, right? So athletes have to represent a country. You're not representing yourself, sure, your name is, but when you win, you compete, you display your nation state in your uniform, and then your flag and your national anthem is presented and played if you win. And then tallies, all the different medals are tallied according to nation state. And then there are some nation states that aren't invited because the country has not participated by what's called the Olympic truce, which is linked to war. And so Russian and Belarusian athletes don't get to compete under the Russian flag or nation state. So even just something like as simple as like the Olympics, all of that is geopolitical. And then there's economic issues that are always involved. There's transnational, we look at, the legacy of like, what are the most popular sports in the world? They often have the legacy of colonialism, like football or cricket. And so there's really interesting, we can talk about all kinds of things with sport, and there's probably some element of it that has a political component. So we would say, as a cultural anthropologist, like lots of things, you can kind of think about all aspects of sport and probably kind of come up with something that, even if it doesn't feel like it in the moment, you can sort of analyze it from a political perspective. And by political, we mean kind of power. So it's not just about like a nation state or a state, but, the way power works too. So even, other like non-Olympic events, like local events are kind of based on municipalities or states or districts and countries. And so you're kind of pitting people based on their geopolitical location, even on, local fandom. So it's really a kind of an interesting element about something as fun and leisure as like sports or even fitness. So
would you include something like what happened in the 2022 World Cup, the soccer or football World Cup, depending on where you come from, when we knew that, or we learned that in Qatar, slaves were used to construct or to build the stadiums there? I mean, would that also be included under the rubric of the intersection between sports and politics? Also, because not only that happened, but there were also people, for example, from Norway, Erling Haaland declared condemned that, and then Norway as a team was banned from competing in the World Cup. So I would imagine that would be another example of that, right?
Yeah, that's an excellent example. And you will see that there's moments that there's all that kind of underbelly of sport all the time, right? Different kinds of ways in which oppressed peoples are kind of exploited for sport. The slave labor to build the stadiums in Qatar is an excellent example. And then sports are always used as a political realm to protest. The teams that wore armbands or said something or got kicked out or they got penalized, right? Or even one of our famous examples in the United States is the gold medalists in track and field who held up a fist during the civil rights movement in the United States because they didn't want to. They had a complicated relationship with the flag. So absolutely, there's always the Qatarian example is a great example of one. And just the fact that like Qatar, the whole politics of like how Qatar got the World Cup in the first place,
yeah.
right? There's a question of bribery and like cultivating these relationships with the voting members of FIFA. So all of that is like the political element of it. Yeah.
And also you mentioned the Olympic Games earlier, and I heard that in France they are planning on basically removing the homeless people from view because, I mean, it gives always a bad image or a bad rap about the country if people go there. All the eyes around the globe are looking at that particular place, and then there's homeless people on the street. Of course, removing homeless people from the street, I mean, I'm not sure politically and practically what that translates into exactly, but I wouldn't imagine that it would be it would translate into positive things for the homeless, right?
Absolutely. That's an excellent example, right? Where it's not just the country coming to compete, but this image that France has to display as their own motto of liberté and fraternité, that they are, right? They don't have homeless. We don't see them, right? And they're probably just moved for the time, not necessarily placed in stable housing.
Yeah, that was what I was alluding to when I said that it probably doesn't translate into positive outcomes for the homeless people themselves. So tell us then about the interdisciplinary sort of framework that you and your co-authors bring into the book. In what ways is it interdisciplinary?
So there are 13 of us who participated in this book. So it's an edited volume, which means, we kind of got participation from different kinds of people. And then the three of us, I did it, as well as Melissa Forbes, who is also a cultural anthropologist at Brooklyn College, and Noelle Brigden, who's a political scientist at Marquette University. But we wanted to have different voices. So we have cultural anthropology perspectives, we have political science, we have human biology, we have rhetorician, we have media studies people, we have gender and sexuality studies folks, and we have journalists. We have a person who is less a scholar and more of a gym owner in El Salvador, who has an interest, like a very different background than some of us, academic types. And so we have a historian as well. So we sort of tried to bring all different kinds of not only ways of thinking about the body, from human biology to history to political science, but then also like different elements of like evidence. So some of us use participant observation, like I participate in CrossFit, I put my body on the line, I did the workouts, where other people looked at images from competitions or Instagram and social media, or historical documents in the past, or official policies from like the International Powerlifting Federation. So there's all different kinds of evidence that is also used that helps the interdisciplinary nature of our project. All of those different kinds of divergent tracks are sort of the thing that kind of keeps us cohesive is this interesting. We want to focus on a feminist perspective, and the feminist perspective is not necessarily about women, not just actually, we're all women who are participated in this, even though we tried really hard to get more men involved. It's there, we can talk about kind of the reasons why they didn't participate, which is political in itself. But we wanted to look at the hierarchy of gender and how power works in gender identity. And that's what feminism means. It doesn't mean women's sports. It means looking at sports and the way gender is used or mobilized, gendered bodies, gender hierarchies, gender representations are sort of used strategically, manipulatively, to kind of convey or perform or elicit certain kinds of gendered experience. So that's where the overarching cohesiveness is that we all looked at something gender related.
And when it comes to the feminist side of it, here you also include trans women, right?
Yeah.
Because I mean, I'm asking you that because, as you are aware, there's at least one branch of feminism out there that tends to be sort of exclusionary toward trans women, or at least looks at them in a negative light, let's say.
Yeah. No, so our sort of, we're trying to take a decolonial or intersectional feminist approach, which is based on Black women literature, and Black women scholars sort of created that. And we sort of are, are not just interested in like the binary of man and woman, but like the whole continuum of not only human experience, but also the ways in which people think about gender. So the experience of transgender women and men is part of our story, but it also is like how transgender identity is weaponized in strength sports and why strength sports in particular is it such a big deal. So we're interested in gender and sexuality but gender like in all different kind of complicated ways. So my paper in the book is about the masculinity of CrossFit. And so it's not just about men and women's bodies, but the way in which CrossFit kind of cultivates a kind of violent, intense, really aggressive, militaristic tone, which is interpreted as a masculine approach for both men and women.
One very interesting thing is that you divide the book into three main parts, and you label them the public body, the disciplined body, and the social body. So why do you establish these three different dimensions of the body, and what are you trying to capture with them?
So the book, we put a call out, which is kind of just an academic term of like asking if anybody wants to participate. We use listservs and our own networks. And so we didn't know what kind of other research we were going to get. And so part of what is sort of analytically trying to think about the different kinds of papers and arguments that are being made in each of these chapters. And we found that they actually they were different enough that we needed to sort of, aggregate them into little groupings. And so the first section, the public body, is about the way bodies are represented and gendered in like representational, like either images or documents. And so in the three chapters in that section are one about CrossFit and femininity, for women who are in the elite CrossFit competition called the Games, and the way in which, even if their performance sort of is better than the men, the commentators and the imagery of the CrossFit Games still really focuses on feminizing them. So they wear pearl earrings, they have their hair done, right? They have makeup on. They're like trying to be as feminine as possible, even though their bodies maybe are very muscular, they may be very strong, and they may be actually beating the men in head-on-head competitions, which even the commentators can't imagine that ever happening. That's not a good thing, even that it, for them, for the commentators. And so the researchers analyzed how that's the case, like how women both kind of resist these markers of femininity, but then also use them so that they are considered women still. There's also an examination of the fit motherhood, of like strength athletes who are performing motherhood while they are pregnant. And this is using social media imagery and social media comments from people about that, about a pregnant woman strength training or competing, or a recently postpartum woman competing in a strength sport. And then the final chapter in that section is on the transgender policies. So it's actually analyzing the way the policy is framed, so the discourse of the policy. And then in each section we have what's called an interlude, which is just a personal story from one of our scholars or participants who sort of tells their own. It's like less researchy and more just a personal anecdote of what it means to be a woman in these gym spaces, doing these strength sports, and how it kind of changes their own experience of themselves and of their world. So there's an interlude in that chapter. The disciplined body is really about the way this sort of gender and power gets kind of into our bodies, into our muscles, into ourselves, the way we understand our fitness. And so in that, there's two chapters, one on the history of German turners in the United States, and then mine, which is on CrossFit hero workouts and the way in which those are used to build a community predicated on death, which is called a necrosociality. And then finally, our last section, we had chapters that were really interested in kind of pushing back, doing a little bit more than just research or analysis, and kind of thinking about what ways can strength sports be a method of solidarity building or resistance or collective action. And in those, we have a co-edited chapter by Araceli and Noel, which is about a gym in El Salvador, and they co-authored that piece together, and thinking about the difference in their own positions as authors. Then there's a chapter on the way in which CrossFit can be a method of healing for women who have experienced some sort of intimate partner violence, and what that looks like and how that actually can be used to do as a healing intervention. And then I co-authored a piece with my colleague Kara Akbach. We did a survey during the pandemic to look at how fitness and stay-at-home orders, how people were using those or not using their fitness regimens to have some sort of health practice or think about their own health and well-being during the stay-at-home orders during COVID. And we found that women knew how to work out and strength train in partnership, in groups, and they mobilized those networks, and they actually were much more resilient and had better outcomes than men, because they knew how to collectively train together. So that was kind of the over three different parts of this sort of book.
So since we're talking about strength sports here, I guess that a very important question, and that you also explore in the book, is what strength means. Because of course, when we commonly think about it, we associate it with just the physical component of it. I mean, how much you can lift, how hard can you punch, stuff like that. But you argue in the book that the concept of strength also, from a political perspective, goes beyond that. So what other aspects does it include?
Yeah, so we really struggled with this. And this is actually part of the reason that we did the project to begin with, because strength sports, the definition of strength sports is a sport that is about as heavy as one can do one kind of event, like the sheer movement of force. And we didn't include like sports that use strength to help them be better at something else, like rugby or American football, or combat sports such as boxing or MMA. We were just interested in, or even bodybuilding. Bodybuilding is about performance and posing, where the strength sports we looked at, powerlifting, CrossFit, weightlifting, strongman, Highland Games, turn-in, were about how heavy can you go? How much strength and brute force do you have? And brute force has always kind of been around kind of a very masculine domain. The idea of like lifting as much as possible, a car, a truck, right? We think about that with the strongman sport. And that's a very masculine domain. And so women, it's become more popular for women to get involved in that. And so in that, there was like, because there was like it kind of more women participating kind of troubled, kind of shook up a little bit about what is strength? How do we think about that? And so we wanted to push past just this brute force sort of understanding to think about what other things are necessary to be good at these sports. They include grace and like flexibility and mobility and agility and technique and like self-confidence and coordination and collective action and solidarity and the social elements. And so we kind of added those to this idea of strength, because when you go and you participate in these sports and you try to perform a one-time really heavy lift, there's so much more that goes into that, whether it's team building, whether it's proper nutrition, whether it's having a coach, whether it's psychological capacities to be able to do that. And so we sort of wanted to think about it as, instead of just that one-time performance, what is it like to sort of do this regularly as a practice? And we weren't even just interested in like elite athletes. We're looking at like everyday men and women who have to kind of do this over and over again. And so we were interested in kind of really just troubling that definition that strength is just about kind of physical capacity to lift something really heavy. It takes so much more than that.
So in this particular case, I mean, according to the view you bring into the book, it intersects with gender constructs as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Because oftentimes, almost, so many times, strength is linked to masculinity, right? And, just on everyday levels, a woman will lift up something heavy and a man will come in and be like, I got it, don't worry. And they'll try to do it for that person. And then in an embodied form, so in not only just moving strength, but also strength is also linked to muscularity, kind of the embodied form of it. If you see somebody very muscular, there's often assumptions about, oh, that person must be really strong. And women have historically and contemporarily, there's problems with having a lot of muscle. Your femininity is questioned. And so we were really interested in kind of how gendered those elements were, how like lifting heavy weight was a man's job, or having muscles is a man's thing. And if you were a woman who had muscles, you might be a man. And so all of that kind of really highlights the sort of nature of the gender element. And also just in general, with even like before we get to strength sports are one of the last places that we separate men and women. Right? In our workplaces, we don't separate men and women, churches, religious institutions, social gatherings, like, some places are still gendered, but really sports is one of the last domains where, right, you're only allowed to participate in your gender group. So, that's always interesting. Like, so when even historically in the United States, we had segregation of sports based on race, and that ended, right, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, but we still have very important demarcated men's and women's sports. And so, kind of like, is it even possible to think about what it would be like if we actually just pick the best people, regardless of their gender?
Yeah, I guess that we'll come to that question when we talk a little bit later about trans women in strength sports and also sports in general, because there's a huge debate right now about trans women in sports. I mean, it's mostly unfortunate, but we're going to get into that. But it's very interesting that you talk about how in human societies we tend to associate muscularity with masculinity, because also sometimes if, for example, a straight man, and I guess that is one aspect of feminism that if we explore here, people will see that it can also apply to men and how men themselves can sometimes be discriminated in certain ways. If a straight man says that he is attracted to a woman who is particularly muscular, sometimes people find that a little bit weird, and sometimes they even question his own sexual orientation, right?
Yep. Yep, absolutely. The link to muscularity as a gender domain is really entrenched. It's very hard to overcome that. Even like, men will go into the gyms and only want to build muscle, and they'll do all these extra kinds of like performance enhancing drugs and put that in their body in order to be more muscular. And women will go in and not want to lift weights because they don't want to get bulky. They only want to tone. And where the thing is I'm an anthropologist, so we do part of our perspective is evolutionary. And as Homo sapiens, humans are not, there's like the sexual dimorphism, which means like vast differences between sexes in terms of size. Gorillas are a very good example of like really strong sexual dimorphism. The males are much bigger than the females. Humans are not like that. There's a lot of women who are as big and tall as men, and there are a lot of men who are on the smaller side. And so the range of like, of what is a typical size for a man and a woman is very much a similar capacity. And that's interesting. So it's like, so even biologically, we're not meant to be that big, that different physiologically. And and women, there's like been a new article from one of our contributors, Kara Achenbach, wrote an article in Scientific American where she looked at kind of the historical, the archaeological, the Paleolithic evidence of humans and their capacities, their different kinds of hormones, as well as their musculature in their bones, right? In the evidence of the bones, that men and women were both hunting, men and women were both making clothes, like their skeletons we've all been, men and women in the historical and archaeological and Paleolithic record there's no evidence that men were much stronger or bigger than women, or even that they were using their muscles more so than women. And so it's just kind of been more recently where we've sort of separated having this understanding that women don't have the capacity. And there's a joke on the internet where it's funny because men will say, you'll never hear a man say, "Oh, that's a lady shark, I'm not scared of her." To this idea of like female sharks versus male sharks being kind of both very dangerous. But we say that about women, like, oh, female humans are not supposed to be strong or muscular or big, or, and we would never do that for another species. So it comes much more less from biology and more from, cultural and power dynamics in our societies.
But since there's also, at least to some extent, that biological element here when it comes to, and of course we're talking about averages here, but on average, I guess that we could say that men tend to be a little bit more muscular than women on average again, and a little bit stronger than women. But do you think that perhaps some of these social expectations or gender constructs also derive, at least in part, from those average biological differences, that average sexual dimorphism, let's say?
So there are obvious biological differences between males and females, no question. But I think really a lot of our science on that is actually because we haven't really looked at a lot about women. We've just kind of focused on men. So there's a recent study and recent information by Joseph Thornton out of the University of Chicago that argues and illustrates that estrogen as an anabolic hormone, which is muscle building hormone, is like twice as old as testosterone. And so this idea that estrogen is not something that is about muscle building or muscle endurance or muscle maintaining is actually not true. But our science, there's so much inherent about science that like, oh, men were hunters. There was a book that came out in the 60s that said that, and it was like scientific. And so people believed it. So I think what we're seeing now is there's a lot of push to do more research with women on biologies of women, on female athletes, on questions about human biology from a feminist perspective, or just looking at the difference between men and women. And sort of looking at that, we don't really know as much as we think we do right now. And what are some of the things that we actually, some of the things we're learning is that it's not as separated by the sexes as we thought.
Mm-hmm. And also, I guess that another thing to consider here is that even though there are those biological differences, it's not that they can't be changed by certain habits that people might have. So, for example, if a man does not do any physical exercise at all, he can be weak or weaker than, let's say, average men, and a woman, if she is into, I don't know, weightlifting, powerlifting, if she goes to the gym and lifts weights, I mean, she can become actually quite strong, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And that's part of it. So this idea that we have innate genetic ability is really, I mean, there's very little there that you have to cultivate that. You have to practice. So you have to, and so that's part of it. And it's, this assumption that all men are better than all women is really wrong. In fact, you will find, right, there are some women who are genetically have better capacities to do certain things. And then if they cultivate it, they're going to be better than lots of men. And, maybe 95% of men in the world. Like if you look at, we have this young female Olympic weightlifter named Olivia Reeves. She's like 21 years old. She's the 71 kilo lifter. And she's won this World Cup. She's the strongest woman at that weight in, the world, and has world records. But men in her gym will still try to compete with her. And she, like, if she competed, more, she can just, easily front squat 330 pounds easily, back squat 440 pounds. And she's like 150 pounds. And so it's like this understanding that she has genetic capacity to be an amazing, strong, she's like built to be strong. And then she cultivates it. But men will go into her gym and think that they just should automatically be stronger than her because they're men. And that's where we really need to push back on that. Like the average is so, like, we are so like overlapping. Our Venn diagrams of men and women in terms of abilities and sizes are really overlapped. The outliers might be, kind of where you see it, but it's, for the most part, you can, and men have more like testosterone and are built to be more, one time heavy, really heavy, do it really fast, where women have more estrogen, which is an anabolic steroid or anabolic hormone, muscle building, that actually has a lot more to do with, sort of strength endurance. So they can do a lot of heavy lifting for a lot longer. And so it's, it's kind of like, what exactly are we testing or competing against? And that, there's actually a lot more overlap than we like to think, from both a training perspective and even a hormonal perspective.
Right. So would you like to tell us a little bit about, sort of the history of strength sports, particularly how women first got into strength sports, how old are strength sports, basically? Basically give us an overview, a brief overview of women in strength sports, I guess, historically.
So strength sports, like the ones that I listed, some, the idea of moving one object that's really heavy, there's like all kinds of, like in the Basque region, there's like these large stones that people will lift and move. And those have a much longer history than like official organized, like associations or federations.
Right.
And who knows what men and if women were participating in that before. But I'll give an example using the sport of Olympic weightlifting, since we've got the Olympics coming up. And that's the sport that's in the Olympics. It's a strength sport. There's two events, the snatch and the clean and jerk. It's with the barbell. And so if you've watched the Olympics and seen this sport, it's kind of like known. And it was the contemporary Olympics were started back again, even though they're from antiquity in Greece. They started the modern ones in like 1890s. And Olympic weightlifting was in the first Olympics. It was, but only for men. And then there were a number of other Olympics, but it was only until 1920, so 100 years ago, that weightlifting was a regular sport in the Olympics.
Okay.
And so, but that was only for men. It was only until 2000, the Sydney Olympics, so that this century, that women were allowed to compete in Olympic weightlifting. And the question is, did they not want to lift? Or like, what was that? There had been women in the Olympics much earlier that in many other sports, right? But the idea that a strength sport, this idea of brute strength and moving as much weight from the ground to overhead, which is essentially what weightlifting is, didn't let women participate for 80 years. And currently in the United States, Olympic weightlifting is a predominantly female sport. There's like 60% at various competitions that are women than men. And so part of the argument is, why weren't women supposed to participate in that? And then, but also looking at how recently they have allowed women at like the most elite levels to participate in that. And women, depends on different parts of the world, Eastern European countries, Russia, China, Central Asian countries, and Iran, Iraq, Georgia, Armenia, have all long histories of weightlifting and are some of the best teams, best nation states in the world. And sometimes they have very few women still participate in those countries in the sport. And they are, even though the men in these countries dominate the men's weight classes, the women actually are, more Chinese, some Colombians, Americans, and there's a handful of other elite countries as well. But it's interesting that a lot of the places that even the men have always dominated in weightlifting don't have a strong female cohort. So it's almost like we're seeing it unfold in real time, where women, there was a focus in the United States, at least, to include more women in all kinds of sports. In the 1970s, there was a law passed. Women used to be able to play just tennis and maybe a little bit of golf, but mostly it was tennis. And then, so it's only in the last 50 years that women in general were kind of allowed to participate or encouraged, and there was money and focus to get them to participate in sports. And strength sports are, because it's about power and brute strength in general, are like lagging behind in terms of, because they're thought of as male dominated and masculine sports more than others. Say gymnastics, correct? So.
And where do you think that this sort of exclusion for such a long time stemmed from? Was it, again, societal expectations, gender roles, or what exactly?
I mean, I think that part of it is just gender roles, like it starts out that way. The idea, a lot of times in a lot of contemporary American societies, there's like a public realm, which is sort of the masculine or male dominated realm, and then the domestic realm, which is the women's realm. And something like even fitness, like exercise, used to, in the United States, the main way that women could exercise was through the television, through Jack LaLanne and his television show. So they didn't necessarily even get fitness out in the gym. They got fitness in their home because that's where they were. And men were in gyms or doing sports or like playing out there on the courts or the pitches out there in the public realm. And so a part of it is just that basic understanding of like where men and women can be in the working world or in the domestic world. And then this idea of sports as entertainment is also a really important element that's used a lot of times still to be like, oh, well, women's sports isn't that entertaining. Or in order for it to be entertaining, they have to wear really skimpy clothing and it's kind of sexualized. And so there's still a lot of this kind of like prejudice about women's sports isn't interesting, it's not entertaining, and, men don't want to watch it. And so therefore we're not gonna, have it on television or fund it. But there's a good example that's interesting this year is there was this young woman named Caitlin Clark, who is a basketball player for the University of Iowa, which has never been a dominant basketball college. And men's basketball is very, very popular in the United States, and it's also very popular worldwide. But women's basketball is not. And there is, even though we have a professional women's league in the United States, the WNBA, but this Caitlin Clark, more men and women watched her college games this year than any other basketball game in like 10 years, men or women. And so this understanding that women aren't, kind of pushing a little bit, using this young woman whose, capacities are extraordinary, kind of actually troubled a little bit, the assumption that women's basketball or other women's sports aren't interesting or fun or entertaining to watch. And so that has changed she has changed the economics of the WNBA by just being like she just got drafted. And being in college. So I think we're kind of trying to trouble that a little bit, but it's still really lagging behind because of just basic assumptions and prejudices about men and women and what's fun to watch and what's interesting.
I'm really fascinated by this because, as I told you before we started recording, I follow American wrestling like WWE, AEW, stuff like that. And I've been following it since the early 2000s, so almost 20 years now. And I've seen lots of transformation, evolution in terms of how women were presented in the early 2000s versus how they are presented now. I mean, in the early 2000s, they were basically eye candy. And now they are actual athletes and they compete in actual fights. And even right now, wrestling fans, whenever they do not give the women good storylines or good fights, they get mad. So even the expectations of wrestling fans changed over time, just because at a certain point in WWE, for example, it was the mid-2010s, they started pushing more and more for women's wrestling, and they had an entire pay-per-view just with women in 2018. So sometimes even just you marketing more women's sports also changes people's expectations, and they get exposed to it, and then they notice that, oh, wait a minute, perhaps women are just as athletic as men. So.
And entertaining. That is an excellent example. It's like, oh, turns out men also do want to watch women in the WWE. Like that assumption that they didn't is often an assumption. So, and also like people assume it themselves. They're like, well, I've never watched a woman and they have these terrible storylines, but give them good storylines, give them like kind of some cool stuff and have them be athletic and compete. And you're like, I'm rooting for the woman. So yeah, I think it's also, and we've also just kind of, there's been a lot more, social media has really helped with this as, media exposure is become a little bit more democratic. So even if you weren't on ESPN or on, their own channels, people were, sports and fitness really used Instagram to push out different notions and to get like really interesting examples of people kind of embodying different sorts of, kind of pushing against some of these gendered embodiment of prejudices and notions. Yeah. And people are like, oh, wow, women can be strong. And so I think that really helped. Then it becomes a lot more mainstream, and WWE and CrossFit are really good examples of one, recognizing and respecting the capacity of women and have them kind of competing against men head on rather than just themselves. And that's, that's a really great and interesting thing just to kind of, shake it up a little bit and see what falls out.
I mean, actually, it's interesting that you mentioned that sometimes women compete against men in wrestling as well, because actually in wrestling, there's a long tradition, even though it's not that common, of intergender wrestling. And I mean, the wrestling fans do not care at all about if women compete with men or vice versa, as long as the fight is good enough and the storyline is also good enough. I mean, we don't care at all about gender categories there.
And I think that's a really good example. Like, you know, that some of this stuff we think is really entrenched or even biological actually may not be that entrenched, and maybe, right, let's see how it goes. And I think that's a really good example. Like, I don't care who it is. I want, that woman and that woman on my team. If I'm, that's who I like, and I'm going to show up to watch them. So that's great. Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit now about, of course, a very contentious issue that people in politics generally, particularly in the US, have been discussing a lot in recent years. Let's talk a little bit about trans women in strength sports and also sports more generally, because the argument they make here is about sports as a broad category. So what do you think is the main issue here? Why do you think that people have been reacting so aggressively to trans women in sports?
I think a lot of it has to do with just how gendered sports are, period. Right? So we, in, say, the Olympics, just because it's coming up and it's a really good example, but everywhere it's like you have the men's teams and the women's teams, or the men's swimming and the women's swimming. And so because instead of just, the Portuguese and the Americans, and then we're going to have mixed gender, kind of like wrestling, so part of it is just that we still separate men and women. And we do that because we have these inherent understandings about biology. And a lot of the gender stuff is based on the understanding of biological sex, that there's two sexes and that's it. And there's all kinds of, science that argue, right, there's a continuum of human Homo sapien sort of gender aspects and sexual aspects. Like, not everybody nice and neatly fits into just male or female. And we categorize that based on like reproductive systems or hormones or like chromosomes X and Y. But we know that there's so many humans with like XXY and XYY and varying hormone, ranges. And then also there's men and women who have both sexual reproductive organs. And so these are not outside of the norm of human experience. But we don't, a lot of times we're sort of solidified into this as male and female. So I think that's part of it, is just that we aren't as like, we've so quickly, historically just had to decide if somebody was a male or female at birth, based on looking at, their genitalia when they come out. But really that's much more complicated than that. And we're just starting to see how that's the case. But that has really prevented. So, and transgender men and women is about experiences of themselves in a particular body. And maybe that doesn't, who they experience themselves to be, it does not match with sort of the biological body that they have. And so part of it is like, so then there's this disjuncture of like, can you then as a transgender woman, say, if you were assigned male at birth, become a woman? Like, do you do that biologically? And then how would you do that biologically? Is there, and the only place that we have to like prove that we're men and women is in sport, right? You don't have to go to work and prove you're a man. No one's going to ask you to, right? And in women's sports, historically, women have had to like be examined by doctors or show the private parts to, representatives. They've had elements of themselves like measured in order to prove that they're women. And so that's really, a violation of your own personal space. And the only place that we demand that is in sport. So it's really important to kind of like think about that. But women have been policed for a really long time to make sure that they are actual women. And this has, a good example of that is Semenya, who is the 800-meter runner out of South Africa, and she's a athletics. She competes in athletics, and she has been in constant battle with the International Association for Athletics and the Olympic Committee, that she experiences herself as a woman.
Mm-hmm.
She has a particular kind of hormone that is associated with men. So her ranges and it's not testosterone.
Mm-hmm.
And she turns out she has both reproductive organs. So instead of ovaries, she has testes, and she doesn't have maybe a uterus, but she is a different kind of woman. That's how she understands herself. But because there might be she might have capacities, inherent biological capacities based on those things to make her better, they don't let her compete in the sport. And that's where it gets interesting, because there are all kinds of biological advantages that people are automatically born with that make them better at a sport. So if you are born 7 foot tall, you are going to be really good at basketball. You might be really good at basketball. People are going to think you're good at basketball, and they may spend all this money to get you a coach and for you to practice. And then you can make millions of dollars in, basketball leagues.
Mm-hmm.
That is never considered unfair. That is never policed. No one is ever kicked out of basketball because they're too tall or even too short. But it's this idea that people can be born with biological advantages, and the only ones that are policed are gender aspects. And so part of it is just, we really need to kind of really be critical about some of those assumptions that we have about what is a man or a woman, period, but then also what parts of our biology are considered fair and unfair. And why is it always about gender? And why is it always about women? And why have we always policed women? And those women who were like really good, we questioned whether they were really women. And that has a long history in all kinds of sports. And part of it is that, being really athletic and having athletic prowess is been considered a male domain. And so if you're a woman who's really good or really muscular or really fast, they don't think you're a woman. And so that's where we just need to kind of really think about the historical and cultural legacies of those kinds of things. And to say, like, do people who are transgender really have a lot of unfair advantage? Is that really possible? And first of all, how many transgender women and men are there out there trying to compete? And then second of all, like, do they win every time they go out there? That's the fear, is that they're going to always win. And that's not the case. There's a Laurel Hubbard who is a weightlifter, strength sport athlete in 2020, the Tokyo Games. She competed, and she was assigned male at birth, and then transitioned, and she got 7th. She didn't win. So yes, she's really good, but she's also been doing weightlifting for like most of her life. So is it because she's a transgender woman that she's really good? She's 7th, she didn't win. All the women in her category who were not transgender beat her. So those are the kinds of things where we need to actually see examples. We need to let inclusion to really see if they're always going to win. And, to kind of understand some of our own kind of shackles of why we think the way we think. And I think there's part of this idea that, and this has been a fear for a long time, is that men are going to dress up as women and compete. Right. There was like a whole bunch of rumors in the 1980s at the Olympics that the Soviet Union had sent men disguised as women to compete in women's activities. And so there's a long history of sport and mediocre kind of men getting to beat all the women. And again, that's just this assumption that, men are inherently better than women. And that men are going to disguise themselves or even undergo sexual transition and gender identity transition in order to compete in a sport, and then that's going to change their whole identity. A lot of that stuff is just fear mongering and really kind of concerns about things that really are there. They're moral panics, right? They're kind of conjuring up this fear when there's really no evidence of it being a problem, and whether participating, where men are not disguising themselves, and transgender women aren't always winning. So like, what is really the issue about, that kind of thing? And, that's sort of I think some of the concern about it, and why we shouldn't be as concerned, I think, as we are.
So I might be missing the mark here with what I'm about to say, and if I'm wrong, please correct me. But I mean, what I hear mostly from conservative right-wing people in the US, particularly when it comes to the issue of trans women in sports, is that they're trying to protect, as they say, women's sports. But one thing that I find really curious about this is that, so until very recently, you didn't care, and by you, I mean, they didn't care at all about women's sports. I mean, they even bash women's sports. They say that women are weaker than men. They say that soccer players, I mean, female soccer players are much worse than men's soccer players or male soccer players and all of that. And now suddenly, just because there is a tiny number of trans women, trans people wanting to compete in women's sports, you're worried about protecting women's sports. I mean, I mean, as I said, I might be missing the mark here, but it seems to me extremely obvious that the issue is that they are transphobic. It's not that they care about protecting women's sports at all, right?
I would absolutely agree with you. And it's just kind of another turn. They're very much, there's a lot of like fear or hate against queer people in general, whether it's gay, lesbian, marriage issues. But so that's an inherent kind of conservative perspective. And then it's also like policing of women in general, right? Conservative politics, especially in the United States, is very much about policing women, right? We see this now in the sort of transformation of our abortion rights and access, and penalizing people who help women who get an abortion, not allowing women to get abortion even in dire circumstances. And so that's like the whole pro-life situation, but it's less about life again, and it's a lot about policing. So I think there's less, that's kind of the patriarchalness of, it's a lot about control. It's a lot about controlling women. It's a lot about controlling sport. It's a lot about controlling politics. And these are men making these decisions, or they're women who are kind of patriarchal as well. And they think that, women, transgender women are going to take their daughter's spot or their spot. And there's just, you're right. Like, it comes from, a perspective that is, a lot about hate and a lot about, policing women and continuing a particular form of patriarchal domination as an ideology in the United States, for sure.
But taking into account that there are biological differences in terms of genes, hormones across people, and some of these differences might bring advantages to a few people out there. In what ways do you think that sports should work if they are not gendered? I mean, in what should there still be categories, and if so, what kinds of categories?
I mean, I think this is an excellent question. It's even somebody who studies sports. This is such it's hard to even think outside of that gendered box, right? Like, oh, I didn't even know that was an option, right? And it is an option when you have little kids, right? Or WWE is a good example where you're like, oh, look at him play. And that girl's faster than that boy. And that girl's stronger than that one. And that boy's taller. And, like you look at, like, I have got two nieces and they're both the tallest people in their classes, hands down. So will that always be the case? Who knows? Like, we grow in different times and places. So I think that, maybe it could be about like ability, like levels of like, kind of novice, intermediate, elite, and kind of thinking about, not only just, your genetic capacities, but also like how much training do you have? How much effort have you put into it? How many years have you been doing this sport? And also like, you're not going to have a lot of people like doing ice hockey in, say Kenya, right? The whole like, there was like that show about the like Jamaican bobsledders, right? This idea of like, there's all different kinds of reasons that people don't do sports and people do sports. Right. Some like I love the country of Georgia, and they have amazing weightlifters, but they're not necessarily playing baseball. But that's like to be, but they have like this long heritage of like this being a strong weightlifter. And so culturally, like there's all different kinds of reasons why we go to different sports and participate in those kinds of sports and have an identity based on that. So I think that we could think about it, in different kinds of ways. We have all these leagues around the world, like the American Basketball Association, and then, the European one, and like what if we sort of like thought about, different kinds of ways of like, including more people from different parts of the world to do winter sports if they don't have snow, or, there's like the possibility is actually endless of how we could think about these things. We just really haven't tried. And I think that there's ways in which we could just, if we're gonna think about competing, right, and winning, which is a lot about what sports is, right? Sports has this understanding that there's a winner and a loser. It also has a rhetoric and an ideology about being fair, right? Nowhere else are we sort of as concerned about fairness as we are in sport, and very rarely. And so kind of thinking about the ways in which we could, get the best people, whatever they look like, whatever gender they are, to be on teams, and how might we understand those teams. So I think there's all different kinds of ways to think about it, and we just really haven't done a whole lot of it. So what if we tried?
But in the particular case of strength sports and many fight sports, there are, for example, weight categories. Do you think that at least those we should keep? Or no?
So I think that's a good way to do it, where, we could, because that's part like lifting strong, heavy weight, it's dependent on how big you are, perhaps. I mean, that's an assumption about it, right? A small person, a 55-kilo lifter, is not going to lift as much as a super heavyweight who could be as heavy as, 180 kilos. So very different. So maybe we do weight classes, or we do, the classes based on experience, or classes based on a test and a level. Like if you run a certain weight, or run a certain time, or lift a certain weight, no matter what gender you are, you get to be in the top group. And so then you can compete. So I think there's all different kinds of ways. Those are still even a little gendered. The women's heavyweight is, 87 in weightlifting is 87 kilos plus, which is not a very big person, right? That's not a heavy person really in terms of like, but everybody over that weight is considered a super heavyweight. And so I think we just need to think about like humans of all ilks are getting bigger. And so like, let's think about kind of the range of human bodies, rather than just that women should be smaller than, men's super heavyweight is 109. And so, that's like, can be a considerable difference. So like weight classes, abilities, ages, length of doing it, all different tests, if you have like things that are timed or weighted, having a test to get into the super elite or the intermediate categories. So and even have your best men and women on the basketball court, say like a team sport, or in a relay, or kind of to be the fastest people out there. Because you have a lot of women, like the 100-meter dash, who are competing at the Olympics. They're faster than 99% of the male population, right? So kind of thinking about it, pushing ourselves. And it's hard, I think, for sport to think about it that way. But WWE is a good way to, I'm glad you have that experience, because that's like, like, who'd have thought they'd be so progressive? you
Yeah.
know, they're kind of pushing us to think about it, and that's great.
Yeah, I guess that they found out that there's good money for them to make with that as well. So,
Exactly. When you like limit women's participation, you're alienating half of the population and their income. Like, what are you doing? Get them to the floor, get them into the ring, get them into the stands, get them onto the couch to watch it. And it's surprising. It's like amazing. Yeah.
yeah. No, you know, it's very interesting. I never thought about things like this, but since I also follow soccer and different soccer leagues in Europe, one thing that never crossed my mind was that you mentioned, for example, age there in terms of a category we could use. But in soccer, for example, people do not care about age at all. I mean, you have 30-year-olds competing with even 16-year-olds, sometimes 18-year-olds, and the 30-year-olds are much more experienced, and I mean, they are older, of course, and people do not care about that at all. So that's just another example of how perhaps we have to look at things on a case-by-case basis, and what is common in a particular sport is what people find normal, because no one questions that at all in soccer, for example.
Exactly. And think about how much different you are at 30 than you were at 16. And like what parts are actually better, right? So you're much more calm, you're much more strategic. You might know that you've had longer to do it. You like can read the field better. You like have this intelligence and this maybe psychological like, calm to like take a penalty kick when the 16-year-olds are like all nerves and they may have these great skills, but they don't have that like, and so is that unfair? We would never say that would be unfair. We just think that, oh, that element of it just makes them better in that kind of way. So I think like that's the kind of stuff we just, we really need to think about. Like so many things make somebody good at a sport that are beyond and above the genetic and biological. And so, and if we want to talk about fairness, we've got to talk about all that kind of stuff. Like when do we decide that's not fair? It's very rare. Like somebody born with a genetic component that makes them really tall, or have in weightlifting, the idea is to have a long torso and short arms and legs. So somebody born like that could possibly be an amazing Olympic champion, but that would never be considered like unfair.
Yeah.
So, but economics, funding, training history, like maturity, support, all of those kinds of things also come into the idea of like, all of that also shapes the fairness of it,
Yeah. So there's also a very interesting topic that you explore in the book related to pregnancy in sport. So this is, of course, a very female issue in this particular case. So what are the challenges that pregnant strength athletes face?
So first of all, biologically, the idea that a pregnant woman and then a postpartum woman, you are for pregnancy, you're building another human being in your body. So that takes a lot of extra calories, lots of extra rest, lots of all kinds of things in order to just be, a person in the world, let alone to compete in a sport or continue to be fit. And then post birth, a lot of women breastfeed, and so their bodies are still for another number of months still the only way in which a baby gets any kind of nutrition and grows. So first of all, it's just biologically this idea that you are building a human being and creating a human being for at least a year, right? For a lot of women, if not more. And then there's all the different kinds of changes that happen. A lot of, there's different kinds of hormones that make your joints relax, or, have, different kinds of like less aggression and more sort of loving notions. And so that can change whether or not you can do strength sports like lift really heavy. If your joints are really lax, you may hurt yourself. So there's all kinds of biological issues that sort of prevent it, but there also there's a lot of evidence that my friend Kara Ackerbach is a biological anthropologist, and there's evidence there's fossil evidence that women while pregnant were still doing all the things that they can do. And this is the case. Women can continue, a lot of women can continue to do a lot of normal things while being pregnant. And if you're used to training and you're used to pushing yourself, doing a strength sport before you get pregnant, there's a lot of evidence that you can continue to do that. Even as you get bigger with a belly or get closer to birth. And there's like tons of examples of women who have been elite athletes who continue to do their sport for long into their pregnancy. And then shortly after they give birth, they'll continue to train or compete. And that's not all women. Some women have complications in their pregnancies, obviously. But this idea that women aren't supposed to do things like that, lift heavy or run fast or run far, I think is kind of a misunderstanding and just assumptions about kind of policing women and their participation anyway. Biological evidence is that women can continue to do a lot of that stuff and are actually, like, estrogen is like an inherent muscular endurance anabolic that helps them do that. We actually have been kind of evolved to be able to like build humans and continue to like be in the world in a very physical way. There's evidence of that. So it's not that we shouldn't just, kind of not do anything. So I think that's part of it is there's a misconception about what women should be able to do. And that's kind of because of the medical field there, but there isn't a lot of, some of the science in medicine is lacking about menstruation for women, as well as pregnancies for women, and as well as postpartum. And so we're starting to rectify that. There's a lot more research on that kind of on experiences and biological evidence of these kinds of things. But there's understandings about what makes a good mother, and including during pregnancy and post-pregnancy. And I think that is what kind of polices women more than anything. So the article in the book, or the chapter in the book that looks at like posts, Instagram and social media posts that women who are strength athletes who are continuing to lift really heavy, with maybe their outfits on their video or sports bra and little shorts, and then their belly is sticking out and they're lifting a big barbell and it looks like it's a lot of weight and it's heavy, maybe less weight than what they have been able to do. Maybe they have taken weight off the barbell because they're not feeling as strong, but they're still doing their sport. And the comments in those videos are really about, kind of challenging this woman's good motherhood. And that's how they frame it. Like, you're not a good mother because you're doing this. And so, and in the United States, we see this a lot of time where the priority of the child in utero and out of utero is really kind of the focus, and women's joy, health, like well-being is really kind of put on the back burner once they become pregnant or become a mother. And so I think that's part of that, is like thinking about, why do we not care about women's mental health, physical health, ability to perform their sports and their activities, especially if it's like an income generation thing. Like if you're a pro athlete and you're, and Alex and Felix is a good example of this. She is this, most gold medal athlete in the world in track and field, and Nike, who was her sponsor, was like, well, we're not going to pay for you while you're pregnant. And she couldn't believe it. Like, all of a sudden, this was like, and so they weren't committed to her as a person. They were committed to, so she like dropped them and went with a women-owned athletic company. And she came in, postpartum, like a 10 months postpartum after a C-section, which is a major surgery. And she won her 12th Olympic gold medal after she was pregnant, after surgery. And Nike didn't want to support her during her pregnancy, during a very short window where she didn't train. So she was training so much of that time, and Nike didn't. So I think Nike now has changed their policies. But that's because someone as elite as Alex and Felix had to push back on that. So, and that's recent. She was an Olympian, like in the 2010s. So it's just now that we're even thinking about like like what can women do while pregnant? And then letting them decide and not policing them based on kind of misunderstandings from the medical field or patriarchal assumptions about where's the woman's place. And just what you can, biologically do might be an individual basis. If you've never strength trained before and you start it while pregnant, probably not a good idea. But if you're an athlete who's been doing this sport and of CrossFit or powerlifting or weightlifting for years and then do that while you're pregnant and then shortly after you give birth, that's probably not as big of a deal as we think.
I mean, I guess that all of what you said there connects to the fact that because women are the ones who can get pregnant and the ones who give birth, unfortunately, in human societies, there's this very strong tendency to police women's pregnancies, sexual behavior, if they ever have kids or not. I mean, and sometimes it even gets contradictory because people are always trying to socially enforce this idea that people should have kids and particularly women should have kids. But at the same time, you mentioned an example there. Sometimes women, if they want to have a career in whatever kind of domain, they get penalized for getting pregnant and having children. So, I mean, it's a mess.
Yeah. And there's a lot of assumption about like, that they're never going to be fast again or strong, like that something about that giving birth is going to change their bodies. And, I think it's pretty biologically incredible that a woman can build a human being and feed a human being and still perform high levels of activity. That's an incredible capacity of strength that is not part of our current definition. But what if it was, what if, like that's an above and beyond like a strength and endurance thing for a person to be able to do a sport, train for a sport, and build a human being in their body.
Yeah. So
remarkable.
Since we're also talking about feminism here, do you think that a strength sport specifically can link to women empowerment in any way?
So that was part of our focus for the whole book to begin with. We really wanted to the people who do it kind of feel like it's an element that's empowering. We are all of a sudden strong. We can lift our own stuff. We can move our own beds. We can do we can schlep our own groceries. And then that also makes us more confident in ourselves. So a lot of women in the research I do on CrossFit, they talk about how they use the new things that they're able to do in the gym to like be more confident in work. And so things that like empower them in the gym, empower them to speak up for themselves at work or to ask for a raise or to, not take a lot of flack from men. And it's really an interesting element, this idea of a physical kind of strength gets sort of transmuted into a psychological, a spiritual, a social kind of strength. But there's also oftentimes we found in our research is that oftentimes women had to, like many other things, adapt to the more masculine or male dominant way of doing things. And so is there, one of our interludes talks about this, where one of our, Kara Akabak, was, started doing some powerlifting, and she felt like she kind of took on a lot more of an aggressive, domineering kind of persona, and felt like she had to do that. And she didn't like that about herself. She's like, that's not how I want to be. Yeah. And so thinking about like, how can we sort of trouble again, this idea of strength so that it's not just masculine strength that we think about, but it's like collective strength. It's about solidarity. One of the big things in a lot of neoliberal societies is this idea that it's about like health and then therefore strength, or even your economic status is all about your own personal abilities. And so strength oftentimes is about, my own capacities. And that's less empowering. That's maybe empowering for one person, but that becomes also a very just you on your own. Like, what about community solidarity? What about that's what the gym in El Salvador was, this idea of like, it's not just about me getting stronger, but how can we get our community stronger? How can we use the gym space to, break down gender barriers? But what also, can we use it as a like education space? Can we teach people to read there? Can we have it as a space where we have different kinds of organizing happen, whether it's political or religious, or what are the kinds of things that we can use, not only our gym spaces, but our move to be stronger, that's less about the individual body as stronger and competitive, and more about kind of bringing more people up and encouraging other people to sort of be a part of this, in both the physical strength as well as like that psychological strength that we talked about.
Earlier I've alluded to the fact that some of these, particularly the aspects that have to do with the gender construct, gender expectations, gender roles, also affect men themselves. Because just to give you an example, and again, since I follow WWE, there's a massive man there, Braun Strowman, and he's like 6'7" or 8. I don't know, he's extremely tall, and is like 150 kilos, 160 kilos, something like that. I mean, he's really a massive person. And sometimes in interviews, he's talking about how his uncle passed away, how he was given an opportunity in WWE to pursue his dream and so on. And he cries a little bit. And sometimes, even for a massive man like that, because people have expectations of him being really an aggressive person, a tough man and stuff like that, sometimes people call him a crybaby. And I'm like, really? I mean, come on, let just the man cry if he feels like doing that, right? I mean, what's the problem with that?
Absolutely. I mean, men are human, women are human. This idea that they don't have the range of all the human capacities because of their gender is just a fallacy, right? I mean, if you have little children, a boy is going to cry just as much as a little girl, and one's going to be tougher than the other. But we do then becomes, quickly we sort of take this human being and we make it into a gendered person. And there's so many kind of regulations about how to be a man or a woman, and a good man or a good woman, or the dominant narrative of what a good man is. And that is like so narrow, right? You have to be strong all the time. You don't get to have any kind of weakness. Like that's a number one like way of thinking about the dominant way to be a man. And that's impossible. Like that is literally humanly impossible. You are gonna either stuff it down and then, hurt yourself or other people, or you're gonna because that's just not how humans operate. And so feminism is like really about just kind of liberating men as well as women, like this idea that men get to be all kinds of things. And in fact, one of the age thing, right? You'll get the older men get, the more comfortable they are with a range, if they mature, they get more comfortable with the range of like being more emotional or being, so that, and they don't see that as a sign of weakness. I think we really need to kind of think about that. It would be amazing if we could argue and make the point that like, in order to actually be that vulnerable and to be that kind of transparent and honest and open with people in the world, that takes a lot of strength, takes a lot of confidence, right? And so I think we really need to, this is a moment of where we really need to think about like, what is our definition of strength, and how does it not include actually experiencing joy and sorrow and anger and love and all of the different kinds of human experiences that both men and women and humans of all kinds, have. And I think because sport is so gendered, and because we link so much of it to men being the best at all kinds of sports, because as we've talked about this whole session, that, men kind of giving any sort of having any give to that kind of like stoic strength kind of thing is sort of understood as a weakness. And, I don't think that's true. I think that actually takes a lot of strength and courage and confidence to be your full self in the world, for both men and women.
I mean, on the confident thing about it, I guess that people don't take seriously enough how, in many situations, you really have to be confident to cry in front of other people, because you know how people, how most people will judge you, and you're basically saying, I don't even care about it. I mean, I feel like crying, so I'm going to cry, and I don't give a crap about it. So.
Exactly. And amazing, absolutely amazing.
So let me ask you then, and this will be my final couple of questions. So since your book is also about exposing people to some personal stories, some personal experiences, I want to ask you about your own personal experience as a weightlifter. So what would you say are perhaps some of the biggest challenges that you yourself experienced as a female weightlifter?
I think I have been an athlete my whole life since I was young. And then in the middle of my life, when I was at my prime, as they say, I had a back surgery and back injury. And so for about 10 years, from like 16 to, well, actually it was about like 16 years, 16 to like 32,
Yeah.
I didn't really do anything athletic, even though I was like state champion and really fast and just did all kinds of sports as a child. And I had a feminist father. So my father brought me to the gym as with my brother. He encouraged me to lift weights. He encouraged me to climb the rope. He encouraged me to do pull-ups. And he had been an athlete, and he never thought that I couldn't do that kind of stuff, even though I was a girl. And so, I have always sort of felt like I've been in my body. And so I kind of always had that perspective too, that someone as important to me who was a man, like my father, didn't think of me any less as a female athlete. But I now weightlift. I started when I was 41, because it hasn't been a sport that women have been able to participate in, right? The first women in the Olympics was 2000. And in the United States, weightlifting isn't like our best sport, isn't our dominant sport. And so it had to be through CrossFit that it became popular. So it was only in like the 2010s that it even became something that was in gyms or something that we would do. So part of it is just like exposure to things, and like, that I didn't, as well as a biological injury. And so thinking about like, so I had entered into a sport when you're as an old lady. And that was something that, but I'm one of the best in my gym. I'm a world champion in my age and weight class. I'm a national champion in my age and weight class. I hold all of the American records in my age and weight class, even though I started only 4 years ago. And so there's like elements about like, even I'm one of the oldest in my gym, and I lift one of the heaviest, and I'm also one of the most medaled, as you would say. And I'm a woman, and I'm an old woman. And so that's like a really interesting place to be, in terms of like younger men come in. There's a young, man who I know who's 22, and he like still kind of thinks about the gym and weightlifting as a very masculine space, but our best lifters are all women. And I am sort of, they call me in the gym the matriarch, because the coach has kind of granted me this almost like a lioness role, where like I'm the oldest, even though I'm a woman, I'm in charge. And so I can tell men to do things that they would never hear from a woman. And so it's like kind of this interesting space where my coach is a feminist as well. And so it's like in this sort of, and I'm a professor, so I'm used to kind of, talking to 20-year-olds, and telling them what to do or lecturing them. And so it's like this, and I study it. So not only do I participate, but then I'm also I did this whole research project on it. And so it's really interesting to kind of think about these younger generation of both men and women who are coming into sports, who are just, born in the 2000s, who are learning to respect women as maybe their superiors in the gym, who lift heavier than them, or who are like more medaled than them. And so I think that my experience kind of coming into weightlifting late and being kind of biologically good, even though I'm old and a woman, I'm kind of built for this biologically, is, kind of in an unfair sort of way. And I think that that's kind of, it really has sort of troubled me and made me think about these kinds of things and how I have been able to do the sorts of things that I've been able to do because of the people I'm with have also been more inclusive, have taken a more feminist perspective, and really encourage, like my coach has mostly women athletes. And that weightlifting, because of CrossFit, is now something I get to do where there was never on my radar as something. And if I had started doing it when I started doing gymnastics at like 5 or 6, like what could have happened? Who knows? Those are, that we never know those kinds of things. But, we kind of thinking about like getting our younger women, and now because of our Title IX and more capacities and this Caitlin Clark phenomenon and more inclusion and this idea that more girls are participating and they're understanding themselves as they could be athletes. And so there's this whole wide opportunity. And then at the same time, because I study CrossFit and fitness, right, there's still this really narrow realm of like what a fit woman looks like. And she doesn't want to get bulky. She wants to get toned, and she's really trim, and she's on the elliptical. She's not lifting heavy weight. There's some pushback against that, but really that's sort of still a lot of our media representation. Ozempic is kind of also added to that narrative. And so I think it's I'm constantly in conversation with it, both pushing boundaries as a weightlifter, as well as and trying to break it down as a cultural anthropologist that, we're not as advanced as we think we are, because we still really police men and women in sports in very, very narrow ways.
And what reactions do you tend to get from people as a female weightlifter? I mean, particularly from men, but people in general.
They will always want to compete with me. So we'll be at the gym and I'll be lifting. If I go to a mainstream gym and not my weightlifting gym, and I'll be lifting, squatting or something heavy, and I can squat 130 kilos, but I'll be squatting maybe 100 kilos for reps, and I will have men kind of get next to me and they'll try to compete. And they have injured themselves. Like every single man who has wanted to compete with me, who doesn't train in like that sport, has injured themselves, whether they've pulled a hamstring or hurt their back. And so it's just like their understanding that just because I'm a woman, that they should be better than me, makes them compete with me, because they're like, oh, she's lifting kind of heavy. And then they hurt themselves. So there's a lot of men hurting themselves, and they just shouldn't hurt themselves. If they really would think about that, they're just not going to necessarily be stronger than every woman that they see. So it's a lot of like initial disrespect, and a lot of bro behavior. And then they might also kind of think, oh, okay, well, maybe not. And I have seen more and more women lifting heavy. And I've seen more and more, I've been at regular gyms where women will come up to me and ask me for a spot, even though they don't know me, because there is this sort of female solidarity about, I see you doing this thing that's usually a male dominated thing, and I'm going to support you, and I'm going to ask you for help, and we're going to support each other in this process. And there's very rarely competition between those of us women who are doing it. It's always the men who want to compete with us. And I really like that too. I really push back, and I encourage it, because then I have to teach them a lesson.
Okay, great.
In my classic professor role, there's always a lesson to be learned.
So the book is again Gender and Power in Strength Sports, Strong as Feminist. There it is. So I'm leaving a link to it in the description box of the interview. And Katie, apart from the book, would you like to tell people where they can find you and your work on the internet?
Yeah. In addition to this book, I have another book coming out this year on CrossFit specifically, called Red, White, and CrossFit. And that's NYU Press. That's coming out this year. So keep an eye out for it. But you can email me at Brooklyn College. I'm easy to find, Katie Rose Hejtmanek. I'm also on Instagram at Max's NPRs. And I also have written a lot on the Barbend, BARBEND.com, for strength sport audiences. And so I have a number of articles on that website that are geared toward a more general audience. So I welcome you to read some of those.
Great. So I'm also leaving links to that in the description of the interview. And thank you again so much for doing this. I really loved our conversation.
Thank you, Ricardo. It was great. Thank you for doing the work that you're doing. It's very important. And yeah, we appreciate your perspective and your dedication to teaching all different kinds of people about so many important topics. Thank you.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Ergo Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingburg, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetrio, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Mikkel Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Forte, Tiago Nunes, Fergal Cossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Labyrinth, João Linhares, Stantantia, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardus France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Dana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavla Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Allman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Loaki, Georgios Theophanos, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry D. Lee Jr., Old Erringbone, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Zigoren, Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismail Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Dios Necht. A special thanks to my producers: Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugni, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Alni Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.